I just want to preface this video with a little note here. So, if you're going to watch this, you're going to see me go from very happy and relaxed to slightly losing my mind. Because these engines aren't very easy to work on, and there's a lot to go wrong, and I also did some stuff wrong. So I'm just going to let this video serve as a little educational thing of what you should and shouldn't do when you're doing the timing on one of these. And I did only show one side because they're basically a mirror image of each other. So if you're confused on how to do the other side, just flip the video and it'll probably make sense. Now, I do have some theories as to why the tensioners collapse on these, aside from bad design, which is what everyone says, including that slight differences in design I noticed throughout the years with ratcheting mechanisms and springs and just oil pressure and whatever else, and check valves. Now that's all speculative. Whatever I say in this video is just my theory. I'm not saying it's 100% fact, but it's just what I think it is. Anyway, yeah, this video is all over the place. It's probably poorly edited. I'm about to pass out, and yeah. Perhaps you made the unfortunate blunder of purchasing an early 2000s Audi product with the 3.2 in it. These engines have a tendency to do the timing chain delete mod if you don't change the oil in time. It also happens kind of randomly, especially on the earlier engines. Now what I'm going to show can be done in vehicle, however I'm doing this as preventative maintenance during an engine swap because the old engine locked up. I did, however, also jump timing and bend all the valves on the passenger side head. I rebuilt the head and then the bottom end of the engine locked up for some reason, and I kind of gave up on it, and we're just putting an engine in it that I know runs. So that's why the engine is outside of the car. But I do think that even if you intend on doing this in the car, which I did before the engine locked up, it's doable. This might be a better point of reference for you because there's some stuff that's kind of tightly packed that might be harder to see in the car, where if you see it outside of the car, you can use this as a reference. And here's the vehicle in question. It's a 2005 Audi A6 Quattro with a 3.2. This is the replacement engine that came from an import junkyard. Of course, being an import junkyard, they were a little like maybe too fancy to let people go in and pull the parts themselves, so they pulled it for us, but it did come with a harness, which is nice. Just a tip, when you go to take the fuel fitting off, you don't have to unthread it. There's a barb here with a hose clamp, and you just kind of take the hose clamp off and pop the hose off. Hose clamp and hose for reference. Now, these aren't completely unreliable, and if you have one, don't let it scare you. Unless you have an 05 that was built in 04, then you should probably let it scare you because those seem to be most prone, from what I observed, to this type of failure. Now, don't quote me on this and don't take everything I say as 100% fact because this is my speculation out of something I do in my own backyard. But this is what the tensioners look like in these engines. It seems to me that the later ones have springs in them to assist them, and the even later ones, and maybe this happened at the same time as the springs, have a ratcheting mechanism inside to prevent it from going back in. If you're unlucky enough to have an 05 built in 04, I am so sorry. There is no ratcheting mechanism or spring that I found when I took the tensioner apart. Or maybe there was and I didn't look into it enough. Either way, this one has it, the other one didn't. Now, someone could have been through that engine and tried to rebuild the tensioner themselves and forgot to put something in it, but from what I can tell, the older ones did not have this. Despite being an 05, in terms of model year, if you look at the actual build date, which is probably not on here, date of manufacture shown above. Oh, okay, 10 of 04, so October of 2004. Now, if you're wondering how the older ones, if they didn't have any sort of thing in them to keep them from collapsing, how they kept their pressure when the engine was off, is that there's check valves, which are supposed to help with that. And again, this one being one of the earliest ones probably isn't going to have what most of the other ones have. Over here is my 08. Now that car has just rolled 200,000 miles yesterday and is still on the original chains and tensioners without any rattling. It's had 5,000 mile oil changes throughout its entire life, maximum anyway. Using oils that are approved by Volkswagen, I ran 5W40 through it the entire time I had it, and the previous owners seem to have done the same. And it's kept it alive, but that's also one of the last iterations of that. The one I'm working on, or was working on, is one of the earliest. And again, maybe it had a spring in it and somebody took it out, but I swear I took the thing apart. There's no spring, there's no ratcheting mechanism. This one I knew had a spring in it, but I found out the hard way that it had a ratcheting mechanism. If you look, that grenade pin's really bent because, yeah, I kind of took it apart thinking I could just put it back in, and then it went click and wouldn't go back. But I caught it before it went all the way out. So, this one's still fine. I had it on the other engine like this and it was okay. But don't do that. Without me rambling over something that's theoretical and probably wrong, here are the parts that you need to do this swap. Swap? Repair? I don't know. I mean, you're swapping parts. So if you want to do this at least mildly correct, here's what you're going to need. So for one, you're not doing this without a timing kit. This holds everything together exactly where it needs to be. It's going to vary depending on the year of your engine, and I know there was also a 3.0 supercharged, and then there was a 2.8 direct injected and a 2.4 indirect injected that had the chains on the back, along with some other engines that, yeah, this kit's not going to fit every one of them. You have to look it up by your year and engine specifically, because like even different 3.2s, depending on the year, see how these bolts line up for these cam lockout bars. Well, some of them have them offset from each other, so you have to make sure that you have the correct one. But either way, you need this tool no matter what. I mean, I guess you could theoretically make your own, but this fits like perfectly down to the exact spot. Next thing is going to be tensioners. Let's talk about tensioners. So it seems to me that if you are unlucky enough to have one of the first 05 cars, like one of the first ones of this generation, so produced in 04, this one October of 04, what's going to happen is you're going to have an unsprung tensioner. At least the ones that I took apart were like that, where inside of this little plunger thing, there's no spring. If you look here, you have some feedback. There's none of that. And so what happens is those are the most prone to collapse. What keeps them from collapsing is these check valves, right? And they also have a check valve built into them. On their own, though, it doesn't work perfectly, and I think these fail too, so I'm going to be changing them out. But the check valves, on their own, don't seem to be enough, because those collapse the most. Later 05, they fixed that problem and put a spring in it. This engine might be out of a 2006 model year, I don't know, but it is built in 2005. This one has sprung tensioners. But for some reason, the original ones did not have springs in them, and I think they only relied on oil pressure with the check valve to keep them from collapsing when the car shut off. It didn't work very well. So what I got are these INA or INA, whatever branded ones, right? Now these ones are OEM. This is who makes them originally. If you compare the old one to the new one, these, all the casting marks are in the same spot, all the words and letters are in the same spot, however, they're different fonts, because, you know, stuff's different. I will say I noticed on these, compared to the old one, these ones had a spring in them. And also, they have a ratcheting mechanism, which is nice. Now, these come with gaskets. You can buy the Volkswagen branded ones, but I'm almost certain they're the same exact part, because what do you think used to be here before they ground it out? Probably the Volkswagen and the Audi logo. So if you buy them directly from the dealer here, it's cheaper to get them brand as INA, but it's the same thing, to my knowledge. Maybe they're built to a different standard. They usually come with a gasket. If you buy these ones, I bought gaskets because I didn't know, but that ended up working out because I'm reusing this one off of the other engine. Also be very careful. Once these go out, they don't go back in because they're ratcheting, which is nice. It's probably like foolproof to fail at this point, but be really careful. I had to bend the grenade pin because I reused it. They still will go in a little bit before they reach that point, like once they ratchet out, because there has to be some play in them, but sometimes not enough to work with. I am going to be putting a new gasket on this one. They're Molly branded. Okay, next thing you're going to need is a Valley gasket for the water separator, oil separator, whatever you want to call it. Basically, it's part of the PCV system. This part sees the crankcase. This 3 holes here see coolant. What happens is this will fail, and it'll either leak outside of the engine or it'll leak oil outside of the engine, depending on... There are enough oil vapors in there to make oil pool up under the intake. And then what's going to happen is it's going to leak into the crankcase, and it'll simulate a blown head gasket, and I've seen people scrap these cars over literally a $15 gasket. This is L-Ring branded, so it's legit. Yeah, I don't like using any cheap stuff for something like this. Aside from the kit, it's the cheapest one I could find. It was used on eBay. Alright, another thing is bolts. You probably want new tensioner bolts. I forgot to buy those, but I'm in a rush to get this thing back together, and I honestly am not too worried about it. However, you should be using new tensioner bolts. Now, cam phaser bolts, these are important. You torque these down to a ridiculous amount, it feels like they're going to snap when you tighten them down. Like, that's how tight they're supposed to be. Use new bolts. Do not reuse the old ones and risk breaking the old one in your cam phaser, because it's not going to be fun to remove. You're also probably going to get hurt if it snaps when it's under that much tension. For your safety and peace of mind, get new bolts. It would suck to have to extract those when it's in the car still. And then, of course, the reason that we're even replacing this gasket, yeah, it's a problem, but it has nothing to do with the tensioner. What does have to do with it is these check valves that are under it, that sit in the valley of the engine. That's just an extra layer of security, because these will leak and then they'll collapse in. And, you know, it'll build pressure back up, but it can jump timing while it's cranking, especially if it sits for a while. That's what happened with the original engine in this car. It did not jump timing until we cranked it, and then you could hear, like, some terrible noises and it bent valves. And any decent timing kit is going to include a triple square socket for these bolts, because it's not, don't try putting a Torx in it. You'll ruin the head bolt, and you'll probably have to, like, extract it in a way that sucks. These are really, really hard to remove already. Don't make it harder for yourself. Okay, looking at the engine, the first thing you're going to have to do is take, in no particular order, valve covers and then these rear covers off. These are supposed to all be held on with T30 bolts minus, I don't know what this is, it's a smaller one, and then someone put the wrong hardware here. This is the wrong hardware as well. They kind of cross-threaded it to get it in. Yeah, you don't want this if it's in the car, because a T30 you can kind of get from a different angle without stripping it necessarily if you go easy on it. A 10 mil to get a socket on there would kind of suck, especially in something like an A4 where the engine bay is even more cramped. Like in an A6, you've got that much space between the firewall to get to that bolt. It's a lot easier with a Torx, in my opinion anyway. So yeah, take all these off. Coils come out, it's probably gonna be filled with oil. Don't be too surprised. Oh yeah, look at that. To replace the spark plug tube seal, really easy. All you have to do is take half the engine apart. Literally, the head is made of two pieces. There's no cam caps. The whole cam girdle is a cam cap that holds all of them in. So if it's leaking from here, that's going to suck. But it's also probably leaking from here. The valve cover gaskets are a very common failure point. I'd recommend getting new ones. Alright, what you're going to want to do is remove these spark plug ignition coils. And to do that, you just pull out on them. Once the harness isn't on them, that's what holds them in, is really the harness. They're going to be kind of hard, especially if they leak oil from the tube seals, because what happens is it creates kind of like a vacuum effect, and then the oil really, really helps that seal. So you might feel like a weird, like, almost like it's pulling back. Just yank on it. It shouldn't break anything. Just don't go using anything against leverage, especially not the connector for the VCT actuator, because you're going to break it off. This is really brittle plastic. I don't even know if it's plastic. It might be Bakelite. Well, I guess that is a plastic, but still, you get the point. Don't use this as leverage. If you're going to use anything for leverage, use the flat part of the cover. Just be careful not to break it, because these aren't as strong as they seem. To get these off, it should be pretty easy. You literally just squeeze these things, right? But unfortunately, a lot of the time they break anyway, so you might have to get creative and shove like a screwdriver under one side and peel the other with your hand, or two screwdrivers. It all depends, but yeah, these are a pain. Don't break these. Do not break these. They suck to fix. And got a bunch of T30s here. The nice thing about these valve covers is there's no hidden bolts or anything weird like that. Like, what you see is what you get. So I just drive them off with an impact. Just don't put them on with an impact. You should be using a torque wrench if you don't want it to leak. These are really prone to warpage, and the last thing you want to do is promote that in any way. They come off really easy though once they're off. You don't usually have to pry on them, but it's probably going to get stuck because I said that and it wants me to look stupid. Oh, yeah, it's stuck. Great. In this case, I use a pry bar, and I very, very lightly, and I mean like super lightly, just pull up on it. And then I'll get it to come off. Find a safe ridge. We're not going to break anything. Yeah, look at that. You can hear it peeling. You see how stuck that gasket is. I guess this one isn't as easy as the other ones I've done. You got to be careful to make sure that none of these bolts are still stuck, because you don't want to strip the head out and you don't want to break the valve cover either. It's not often you see it get stuck to the head, at least not in my experience. I've been through a couple of these. And that's what it looks like. You see here it hasn't jumped timing. This one's actually right at the top dead center position for where the cam lockout tools are going to go, so that's pretty good. Doesn't look very sludgy inside like the other one. Doesn't look very oil stained either, which is nice. The other one was like super dark, so whoever had this must have done their oil changes on time and taken care of it. This is what you want to see. It kind of makes sense in terms of preventative maintenance. I mean, this engine ran when I saw it, so okay. Same thing on this side. Don't do that. That's probably not good for it. I'm not reusing these valve covers. I have some off the other engine that I cleaned and already have new gaskets in them, but for the sake of demonstration, yeah, that's glued down again. I'm not even going to show me taking it off. You get the point. Alright, for these rear covers, it's supposed to be a T30, but they put 10mm bolts, which is delightful. Don't drive these in with an impact. Drive every single one of these in by hand. We'll get to that later on in the video. There's a whole procedure to putting these on. Oh, that sounded awesome. Now, these rear covers sort of fall into that category of almost impossible to remove, especially if somebody's done it with another sealant anytime after it was built, because that means it's even fresher than the factory one. You're going to have to get creative to get this cover off, but you have to be very careful to not bend anything, because if you bend anything, you're going to warp the whole flange, and even if you go to bolt it down, it'll straighten itself out, but not all the way, and then you can have oil leaking. These leak oil super bad. It's a huge issue. This one's already been resealed once, and they got their sealant all over the cam phasers, and it's not even soft. It's like hard tack something, so that's even better. That's just great. But basically, what you're going to want to do is figure out a way to get this off without bending it. And what I like to do is put the end of a pry bar or a chisel or something, a flat one, against this lip and just tap on it with a hammer going around, and eventually it'll nicely peel off. But you don't want to concentrate on one spot and ruin the cover and make it leak really bad. Alright, this looks like it's going to be relatively problem-free for the most part, because I'm looking at it. Look at these marks here. No one's been in here before, at least not to mess with anything aside from, resealing that cover. Looks like they resealed this cover, but this was on the original sealant. It was a little easier to remove. Essentially, though, you can look at these marks here and see if they're all lined up with each other on both sides. That means that this probably hasn't been messed with before. It doesn't mean for sure. More than likely it hasn't. And another way to tell is also you look at the oil stain on the tensioners compared to the oil stain of the head, and they're both made of aluminum. They were both put in at the same time in the factory, and they're both the same color, so they're original in this case, which makes it good. That means no one's messed with anything, no one's improvised, no one's cross-threaded a bolt in. That makes it easy. Also a good time before you do anything else to look down into there, look at the chain guides, and make sure that there's no plastic that's broken off and fallen in there, because if there is and you wiggle that and it falls further in the engine, the only way to remove it is to take this, you have to take the flex plate or the flywheel off and take that whole rear cover off, and then it's not a fun procedure to reseal it and everything. So what you're better off doing is looking into it right now and making sure that there's nothing that you can grab easily before it falls in. In this case, right here, you can see a piece of the guide is broken. There's like a middle section of it missing. So again, even though this one hasn't jumped timing, the guide has broken. So that's another reason to replace these tensioners anyway, even if it can be fixed with something simple like a check valve. Next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to grab yourself a, what is this? Alright, it's an M6 hex head. I have a long one. Don't use a ball-ended one for this. You really don't need it. It's not going to make it any easier. It's a great way to strip something like this out with how hard it should be torqued down. So, yeah, you're going to go in through the motor mount, or above the motor mount bracket. Again, this can be done in vehicle. It's just kind of a pain. Oh, there it goes. Cool. It didn't strip out. That wasn't as tight as I expected it to. It's basically like an oil drain plug. So, I wouldn't use an impact on this. It's not going to be very easy to do in the car anyway. But, basically unthread this guy here, this plug. Okay. Let's see here. There it is. We got this guy right here, which I'm going to clean up with a bench grinder before I put it into the engine. Essentially, it's the same thread, but quite a bit longer. And what this does is it locks the crank in place so it doesn't spin while you're working on it. Before you start locking stuff, and mind you, it'll only lock in one position, but just to make it easier to get everything centered in, what I like to do is I like to take a pry bar and against this pin, put that under and just spin it, the engine, until the holes in the camshafts face directly outwards. So it's kind of difficult to get to, especially with one hand. And it's not going to be perfect like this because there's, obviously if these tensioners are kind of collapsed, there's going to be some play before it engages. So you're going to have to wiggle the crank back and forth before you get it in the right spot. Now, if these tensioners are already in shambles, usually you can grab the cam phaser with your hand or an oil filter wrench and just kind of go back and forth, and you can see how that cam's moving ever so slightly. And so again, there's that much play in it, you might have to wobble the crank back and forth before the pin fits. So don't rely just off of the cams. You're going to have to play around with this a little bit. See the spot where the crank pin goes now that I've rotated it. I barely rotated it at all, but that's what it takes to get the thing to fit. I just like to thread it in by hand, and if you're going to be working in the car, it's probably going to be a lot easier to thread it in by hand from under here than it is going to be to get an extension in through the wheel well or something stupid. So now the crank is locked. It should not be able to move very much. And so now it's time to verify that it's actually locked. Try to move the flywheel back and forth or flex plate, and then put the locking tools on the cams. Now, if you can't get it from the back because it's still in the vehicle, there's an access hole down here which you can turn it with, but just be careful not to ruin the teeth when you do something like that, especially with that little leverage. You don't want to be like beating on it trying to get it to move and you crack one off. One probably won't do anything, but you still don't want to experiment. It's going to be hard to turn it from the front because it's not just like one crank bolt, you have 8 of them. Of course you do for the pulley. So what I've done is I've wrapped a belt around it, and you can kind of pull it. It's not a hard engine to turn over. This isn't something heavy like a small block Ford or something where you're going to be struggling to turn it. You can wrap a belt around this and it's pretty easy to do. It's not a very big engine. The crank is locked and it did have some play back and forth. I don't think that much matters. So what I did was I just found the sweet spot in the middle and left it to sit there. I'm sure it'll move. As soon as I go to take one of these off, it'll turn it all the way out. It's whatever. So these cam lockout bars, again, some 3.2s have these holes offset from each other, and then there's the 2.4 and the 2.8 and the 3.0 supercharged. Just be careful with what kit you buy. Make sure it's the right one for your engine. And even between those engines, there might be variations. So yeah, I like to thread these in by hand as to avoid cross-threading, especially because these cams aren't going to be perfectly lined up. You're probably going to have to wiggle the phaser back and forth to get the bolt to seat right. Do not drive this in with an impact because you risk cracking the camshaft. And yeah, not something that's fun to replace. Here, and I'm worried about this one, the threads look kind of funky, so that's another reason to hand thread this thing. Worked on the other engine though, so it should be fine. Yeah, there we go, it's going, and it just needs to wiggle a little bit. Again, hand thread. If you, even with a ratchet, if you're starting to struggle with it, there's probably something not right. And that's a good time to wobble the cam back and forth before you can get it to fit in. There we go. Yeah, so hand thread. You don't want to crack anything on here. Even like a micro crack in the cam on a spot where it turns is gonna, well, I guess that's the whole cam, but still, any crack on it, no matter how small, it's eventually gonna spread and cause a problem, and you don't want that. Once you have them threaded in enough to the point where you know that it's seated in there correctly and it's not like off at all, you're still gonna, it might start to get hard, because if you look at it, this bolt isn't exactly centered in that hole because the cams are kind of fighting into each other. That's when it's okay to take some sort of hand tool and then slowly, lightly start to put it together. But if you feel any binding or anything, that's a sign that you should probably stop and look into it more. So you see how easy this is going. And for something like this, I want to use an actual wrench, not a ratchet, because with a ratchet it might be kind of hard to feel any spots that you're hitting, where it's harder to get the bolt in, which could be a sign of cross-threading or something else. So yeah, it's just something to watch out for and be careful with here. Once you get more towards the bottom, it might get harder, like I said, because you're going to be fighting the cams. But you'll feel if something binds up. Just a ratchet has a lot of play in it, and it's not something I like to use for something like this. That's just my recommendation. I'm not a dealer tech or anything. I'm just doing this stuff in my, in front of my garage. Now for this, both tools on the top are in, and the crank lockout pin is in place as well. Now is when it's safe to start disassembling stuff. So now, these are really hard to get off, but everything's locked into place, so it shouldn't be too big of an issue. I use an impact. Don't use an impact. Right, so two things I messed up on right there. I had a little too much trust in this bar. I've used it with an impact before. It was fine that time. Apparently not this one. So what I ended up doing was I took the one off the other side. We're just going to do one at a time. That way it doesn't really matter. And, well, it kind of does. You see, if you turn this chain and then those ones jump, they can bend the knobs. I have to be very careful when I do this. But essentially, I should have held, number one, this piece in place. Two, I shouldn't have used an impact. And three, I should have had this tightened all the way down, not just snugged by hand. When I said hand tighten them in, I was referring more to the getting them in as far as you could. But yeah, definitely use some sort of tool to at least get it seated all the way in like it is now. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm grabbing this piece with one hand and that piece with the other, and like kind of like scissors, using it to hold this piece into place, this cam phaser, so I can back that bolt out. And I'm going to leave that in the video. It was my mistake, but I don't want somebody else to do the same thing and ruin their tool the way I did. So I hope that serves to help some people. All right. This is something that I advise you don't do with one person like I'm doing. This should be done with two people. Because when you hold this piece in, it's a single direction that it works, right? So you have to have somebody keeping constant tension, not very heavy, but just enough to kind of counteract what you're doing. Because if you go back the other direction at all, it pops right out. So doing it yourself is very difficult. It's doable. I wouldn't recommend it though. Of course, my entire family happens to be on vacation while I do this, so yeah. Now when you take these bolts out, there's going to be oil leaking, so I have these lined up perfectly to catch it. And now you see why I say not to reuse these bolts, because they'll probably snap. Okay, so these bolts come out. And another thing that I'm going to do, actually, let me put those bolts back in. I'm going to try to compress that tensioner in and put a grenade pin in it. Just to make it easier on me when I remove it. I don't think it's going to work. And I thought about it, kind of, the way the chain drive works. It shouldn't be able to move at all on this side, even if this side is the only one locked. As long as I don't touch anything on that side. So I just have to grab my pry bar here. Yeah, there it is. And essentially make sure that this one doesn't have a ratcheting mechanism, which it probably does. With my, yeah, it does. Okay, so I can't put a grenade pin in this thing. Alright, I guess I'm just going to take it off. So, one. Ooh, that's loud. Kind of acts like a drum, that cover. Also, I don't know if I said this earlier in the video or not, but see how there's just a seatbelt holding this on? Have a chain or something to help it too. And it looks like there's a lot more slack than it needs, but it won't. It's not going to reach the ground or hit the piston or anything. Okay. Now these aren't, despite all the force holding them on, these aren't very difficult to remove. You just kind of have to pull out on them. Okay. I'll just put these back into here. I wouldn't worry about mixing them up because one's for intake, one's for exhaust, but they're very well labeled. Number one, they're labeled, and two, the exhaust one has the spring on the outside. The intake one doesn't. So there we go. Intake one's off. Otherwise, they seem identical, but just don't get them mixed up. Okay. I'm gonna make sure this chain doesn't get stuck in here. This will happen sometimes. It'll get stuck against this tensioner. You have to be careful when you, or against this guide. You have to be careful putting it in so you don't shatter the guide and throw plastic into the engine. You can see this one seems pretty okay though. Like the guides aren't even that badly worn down from the chain. Just the one on the other side that's cracked. Okay, so now that I have this off, I'm gonna look at how I have the chain set up. It wraps completely around as if there were phasers on it. The reason for that is you've got all these bolt holes. You want them to be accessible. If the chain's dangling around, it's going to be hard. Also, if the chain is stuck between there and there like it was earlier, you're not getting that tensioner out. And in fact, if you unbolt the tensioner while the chain's there, you're going to have an even harder time getting the chain unstuck, because it'll be in a way where it'll be hard to get it bolted back on, and it'll also be hard to pull out. In fact, you're not going to pull it out. It just put it like this, from my experience. Now, kind of messing with this. I can't tell if this is ratcheting or not. I'm going to take this tensioner apart actually and look inside and see what's going on with it, because I'm very curious as to what the difference is in design through the years. This might be ratcheting. I don't know. We'll see. After looking at that tensioner, I don't know if it has a ratcheting mechanism or not. At least, I don't know. I think for the first like 2 steps it does, and then from there on it doesn't, which might make it identical to the replacement one. I don't know. It's just weird to me that the original one didn't seem to have a spring in it. I took the little plunger apart and there was nothing in there. So that's very strange to me. I don't know. I really don't know what it is. I kind of want to cut into one of these with a grinder and see what's going on inside. Probably shouldn't, considering it's spring loaded. That's probably like a good way to lose an eye or two. But I'm very curious to see what's going on in there. Either way, once you get the tensioner off, that's what you've got, and then you're going to have a gasket left over too. Okay. You don't want to leave any of this behind, but it's going to be pretty stuck because of how much pressure it's under. There we go. Now, these are gaskets that crush when you tighten them down. You cannot reuse these by, like, any means. And, of course, down there is where stuff tends to get stuck, and it looks like that's not that big of an issue. So that's pretty good. That's going well so far. Yeah. And again, don't take any of this for 100% true, like everything I say, because I'm kind of going with this. Like, as I go along with it, I'm figuring it out. So, I'm figuring it out. That's all I have to say. I don't know, these tensioners are strange to me. This whole setup with the chain and everything on the back. I'm just trying to figure it out. But it does seem like these early ones didn't have a spring in them and relied only on pressure with the check valve, which is stupid. But these later ones don't have that big of an issue with it. I think that's why these later ones, you see them with more miles, like mine being an 08 has 200,000. Still, maybe it was supposed to have a spring in it and somebody took it apart, because I could tell on that one someone had been inside that engine before as well. So it could be that somebody like tried to rebuild the tensioner somehow, it took it apart and forgot to put a spring in and put it back. I don't know, but I do find it very strange. So I'm not going to do any cuts for the reassembly. I'm going to film this whole thing from like start to finish of the passenger side here. So basically, I've got the replacement tensioner here, as well as the gasket for it. There's an oil screen in here too, which I just noticed. Anyway, there's a certain way to line this up. There we go. It does have some tabs on it, which I think when it was shipped, they were kind of squished, or from my storage probably, more than likely. They do seem kind of fragile, so I'm not really going to force them, but just enough to hold the gasket in place. Okay. I'm only going to need one bolt for this part. Basically, I'm going to grab the chain. I'm going to route it how it would sit normally. Okay? Then let's see. So with the tensioner end faces straight down. This shortest one always seems to go in the middle between the 2 cams. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to push down gently. It's not going to go exactly how it, like, perfectly smooth, but we'll make it work. Ooh, that grenade pin better not pop out. It looks like it's about to pop out. That would, it's a waste of $150. Because I don't think that tensioner goes back. Oops. I don't think that tensioner goes back enough. Okay, it's in. I'll get that bolt in a minute. I don't want to put my head under this, because it could pop out and fall at any moment. Okay, so now with the gasket on it, line it up, and I'm just going to start hand threading in a bolt, just to get the tensioner to sit. There we go, now we're good. Okay. dog's harassing me. Just tried to lick my face. Was unsuccessful, thankfully, because ew. Okay. And now I'm going to lightly start to thread these in, lightly, with a impact. You risk cross-threading if you do this, but my hands are super oily and I probably dropped the bolts into the engine, and one's worse than the other, so kind of picking my battles here. I'm not going to thread these all the way in until at the last moment, because there's still going to be some rocking back and forth of the tensioner I have to do to make sure that all the bolt holes line up, because you can have some of them line up and then one doesn't, so you want them all in. It's very easy to drop a bolt into the engine. You don't want to do that here. Okay, there we go. Good, that one didn't cross thread. Definitely don't want the chain to get stuck behind that guide. That's another reason not to torque these all the way down. I didn't, but it definitely needs some more play to it. Especially because you also don't want to pop the guide off with the tensioner. There we go. I know I said it's not good for the chain to fall in because it gets stuck, but there's one bolt that needs to be gotten to with the chain out of the way. Cool. Just leave it there. Again, you hear the impact's not clicking, it's not making any noises. I'm not really pushing these very far in. I'm just putting them in. Of course, in there. Okay. One more. Please don't fall. And mind you, this is reused from another engine because it's still pretty much brand new. It's just kind of oil stained. Okay, cool. So now it's time to torque it down. So it was 9 Newton meters. Let me grab the torque wrench. That's 6 foot-pounds, I think. Pound feet, whatever. Grab the torque wrench. Whatever the hell that is. Alright, I'm back with a torque wrench. I do find it interesting that these have screens in them. I've taken this apart before, so I don't know why now is the first time I noticed. Of course, curiosity gets the best of me about doing that. I want to look into that and see if that screen's plugged up. Maybe that has to do something with why these things collapse. I don't know. Anyway, let's see, 9 Newton meters, that's roughly 6 foot-pounds, and this only goes to 10. So I'm kind of guessing here. This is a really bad idea. Don't do this. So 9 Newton meters is roughly 6 foot-pounds, give or take. Again, this is terrible. Don't like underdo your torque wrenches to try to get a different value out of them that they don't read into. It's a bad idea, but it's all I have. It's probably a torque sequence to this. Sorry. This is one of those situations where you probably shouldn't listen to what I'm doing and maybe do some deductive reasoning and research and think like, it works for me. But you saw what happened with the impact. This is one of those cases where you really should probably look into a factory manual to do it correctly. Which I have, I just don't look deep enough into it. Okay, so there's a click. Ooh, that's way too close to that grenade pin. Okay. These don't have to be in incredibly tight, I know that much. They're really small bolts and there's a lot of them, so there still is a lot of clamping force in here, even with it being so small of a bolt size, because there's so many. Oh, come on. There we go. But I'm kind of trying to do it in a star pattern type of situation and go back over them a second time, because if they're already tightened all the way down, taking it to the point that the torque wrench clicks isn't going to hurt anything. Because if you tighten it to 6 pounds and the torque wrench clicks at 6 pounds, if you do it again, you're not tightening it anymore, as long as it doesn't rotate. Okay, click. Trying to figure out the order I went in. Okay, it's going to be this terrible bolt up here. And also, doing this on an engine hoist where the engine can move isn't probably the greatest idea in the world either, because what ends up happening is some of that force is absorbed and you might get a wrong reading. This is a two-person job being done by one person. What can you do? Let's go over it one more time. Oh, see, that one's loose. I forgot to do that one. There's 6. There's another one. Let's see, 1, 2, I think 3. Okay, that one's already tight. 4. Maybe I already did this one. Yeah, I did. This one up here again. 5. Okay, yeah, that one's already tightened. So that's good. When you go back over a second time, you don't necessarily have to go in order, because you're really just checking the tightness. But I'm doing this kind of star pattern, like squish that gasket down evenly. That's good. You can barely hear the click when it's set this low. It's probably not accurate, but it feels tight enough to me. It feels like I'm gonna break these bolts, honestly, even at such a low 6 foot-pounds, but something. So now I'm gonna go grab replacement bolts for the camshafts. Okay, I'm gonna try to align these spacers the same way as factory. I know it really doesn't matter, because all it is you're reading out from a certain measurement, but it makes me feel better. You have to do this with 2 hands, especially when the tensioner is partially out. Okay. Intake 1. Well, let me double check. It'll say on it. Yeah, okay, there we go. Intake. Face is kind of up that way a little bit. I'm probably overthinking this. I'm definitely overthinking this. It doesn't have to be that fancy. It's also kind of imperative to get the chain spacing right between the 2 of them, otherwise it's just not going to go on. Let's see if I can get away with just putting this one on partially threaded first. Okay. This one. Come on. So aim it up like this, kind of. There we go. Yeah, this is not going to be easy by any means of the imagination. Come on. Go on. Oh, that's not good. Uh-oh, chain stuck. This is turning from here's how you do it to here's how not you do it. Here's how you don't do it. I don't know. There we go. Cool, it didn't break the guide. Nice. I got very lucky there. Don't do what I just did. That was an act of caveman-like desperation. Okay, that's good. try to seat the phasers first if you can. It might be kind of hard to. You might have to just tighten them down, but you don't want them to leak either. And like they'll go on either way, because all it is you're setting them to 0 when you tighten them down, and then they'll move out. So it doesn't matter what rotation they're, or what location they're in. There we go. Okay. You see here the chain's snug between the two. You don't want it to be like one link loose, which you would notice because it'd be flopping all over the place. If it was too tight, it just wouldn't bolt down. Okay. Let's see, where did I put my, here it is. If I remember correctly, it's 70 Newton meters plus 90 degrees, which that's when the it feels like it's going to snap thing comes into play, and why you need new bolts for this, because you saw how much force it took to get them off. Come on. I didn't do anything. Okay. I'm going to pause again to double check my torque specs. So 80 Newton meters is 60 foot-pounds. Well, 59 technically, but we'll call it good. I need a tripod. I think I say that in a lot of my videos. Cool. So unlock that. About 60. And back one off. We'll do 59 and a half. This torque wrench isn't that accurate anyway. Okay. So now, to tighten these, from what I can tell, you want to go clockwise with them. So in this case, you actually want to hold them in the same direction that you're tightening them in. And all that does is it holds the phaser at 0, so you don't skip timing. Or so your timing isn't off by a little bit. Okay. Come on, dog. Come on. Move. And this is really hard to do when the engine is suspended by a seatbelt and a chain, and not something reasonable like an engine stand. Okay, there we go. So that's that. It's torqued down. Then we're at plus 90 degrees. So from here about to, okay, I see where. I don't know if it's necessary to hold it at this point, because all I'm doing is once it's tight, it shouldn't spin with the bolt, but maybe I should be safe and hold it still. Be a good role model for the people, the 5 people that are going to watch this video. Okay. No, it's not spinning the phaser. Okay. So then I need to bring it to about there. Oh my god. Okay, that's 90. Should be using a degree gauge for this, but it's close enough. 90 is like. So there's one. That's why you need new bolts. You'll snap them if you don't get them. This one too real quick. Results may vary. You see how there's a little bit of play that it has. I want to max it out. Oops. And again, these are torque to yield bolts, so they do stretch. And you tighten them. Okay. Come on. set this like to right the center. Okay, that's almost exactly 90 degrees. Straight down. Well, it doesn't matter because I haven't torqued it down yet. Okay. Cool. Okay, and from here I should be able to do it without. It's probably better to do it with because there's still a chance of the phaser moving, but yeah, I don't know. Okay, so to right where it lines up with that. Okay, perfect. Okay, cool. That's pretty much perfect 90. I should have a degree gauge for this, but I don't. Okay, now we're gonna pull the grenade pin now that this side is set. Perfect. And this side's done. It's that easy if you're not a moron like me. Okay. So I'm kind of thinking the reason it snapped wasn't because I didn't use that tool. It's probably more because of the impact and the fact it was loose. So it's vibrating back and forth, which causes that kind of problem. So, yeah. But that's what it looks like when it's put back together, as you can see. See, these are both still in the same position. So when I remove this cam lockout tool, those shouldn't move. They shouldn't be able to move, really. Let's see, I think this is the right size. Nope, not even close. What even is a size anymore? Oh, that's great. It's also a piece of that timing tool that fell right next to that lifter, so I'm gonna have to pull that out with a magnet. Alright, so here we are. Here is the little piece of metal that I pulled out of there. That's important because engines don't use metal for lubrication, they use oil. Anyway, I guess they kind of do if you count oil that has like zinc in it. Regardless, let's pull these timing tools out. You see how easily they come out though. And how the cams haven't rotated because they're set dead on perfect. That's another reason it wasn't a good idea to just hand tighten them, because they could still be slightly off. Now they're absolutely perfect. They were slightly off before because the tensioner was collapsed and whatever, and allowing, it wasn't fully collapsed, it was kind of limp compared to this one. So that's all good. This side is done. I'm probably going to put a valve cover back on this and seal up that rear timing cover. Okay, so I've cleaned that up as best as I can by peeling it off. I don't want to scrape it because it'll fall into the engine. I could do it with a vacuum, but it's nighttime. But I've got it cleaned off well enough to where I'm comfortable that it'll seal fully. Like, yeah, there are still some strips of it, but there's no uninterrupted areas across that mounting flange. I've cleaned this up very well, though. So my sealant of choice is The Right Stuff by Permatex. It's worked the best for me of all stuff that I've tried. So I'm going to try to follow this channel as best as I can. Little tip for this, roll it up as you squeeze it out, because if you try to just squeeze like that, you're going to fatigue your hand and it'll come out super slow and you'll end up getting hurt. Alright, so this is my bead, what it looks like. Try not to go too overkill, but I think I definitely did. I gotta be careful when I smush it down because I don't want it to get into the chain drive and clog any oil stuff up, so I'll be paying attention when I put it down. Now, why did I use red instead of the regular black for The Right Stuff? It's all I had laying around, and it's still rated for oil. It's just extra high heat. It's the high heat version of it. It's good for exhausts and stuff too, so it does work well on exhausts, I will say, and I've used it on oil pans and stuff, and it's awesome. This is like the best RTV ever. Normally the 90-minute fast version of stuff is junk. I'd say that this is better than I've had better luck with this stuff than the stuff that takes forever to set, the normal version. So anyway, time to put this thing on. Alright, so I've got the valve cover on, torqued it down, I think it's 9 Newton meters if I remember correctly. Put this PCV tube in, which shouldn't be too hard. Probably, well, I'm not, you know what, I'm not going to put it in actually, because I have to take this intake off next. It's going to rain, I probably should, just to keep water out. It's kind of a pain to do. You have to push on it basically. But I think that's going to conclude this video. Because, I mean, pretty much what you do on this side is what you do on that side. There's no difference. You just undo everything after you take the pin out and put the new plug in. So, yeah. There's going to be a part 2, though, for the check valves. I'm just not doing those tonight. But I've got this snug down in here, and it's pretty much going to be the same process. And then I can put this stupid thing in the car.